Today is going to be an episode featuring Azura.
Hi, I'm Azura.
We already recorded it, but I'm actually going to be more transparent here. I'm trying some new techniques. First of all, I have to thank the Mellon Foundation from now on because they provided the equipment for today's episode and for future episodes. So cool, Mellon Foundation, rad, they support public scholarship. And then I also want to be transparent about the fact that I'm learning all these technologies as I go, as well as the genre. Something I learned this week is it's good to tell you what to expect in the episode before we do our kind of jingle musical intro. So Azura, what are you going to talk about in today's episode?
Today, I'm gonna be reading some poems that I wrote reflecting on my trip to India recently, where I visited family. I'm also gonna read a poem by Luther Hughes, and we're gonna have a discussion about the ethics of writing and sharing stories about trauma in like the age of social media and that fraught space, and also how social media can be a space of coalition building and solidarity.
Perfect. Stay tuned. So stay tuned for that whole discussion. By the end of today's episode, you should have some idea about the complexity for poets navigating diaspora and navigating the sort of micro traumas that are experienced every day and the problem with social media, like Azura said. What I would like from you is not only comment on how awesome Azura is, because it's hard to show up on YouTube and do this, so truly like let her know that you really saw her and really appreciated the work, but also comment below if you have any opinions on this topic, because it's a really complex problem. We don't solve it by the end of the episode. We just give you a variety of tendrils you can follow. So comment below with your own tendril and I'll always respond there. All right, as always, go to thepoetryblog.com for more information in the podcast edition, the Instagram, which is now my Instagram because I hate Instagram, so Chelsea_Grimmer. And you're gonna also now get Azura's website and Instagram in the episode. Before I forget, if you sign up at thepoetryblog.com for the newsletter and enter your address, I will send you a snail mail welcome card, tiny gift. Again, it's out of pocket, so it's nothing fancy, but it's my way of being like, hey, you're part of our community.
It's really sweet and cute. I loved mine.
All right, so stay tuned and enjoy the show. This is part of our month-long series of the National Youth Poet Laureates. There are 5 for each of the regions in the continental US. So Azura is the West Coast National Youth Poet Laureate Ambassador here in Seattle, so we get to film live. And Azura, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Azura Tyabji. As was said, I'm the National Youth Poet Laureate Ambassador of the West region. I'm a Seattle native, I'm a Taurus, and a lot of what I write about is about Black and Brown identity, existing as a woman in a patriarchal society, and trying to capture radical visions for the future. So I'm really excited to be here and
awesome.
Have our chat. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Azura. And I mentioned with Jackson's that I'm an Aquarius. To clarify, I'm an Aquarius Sun, Virgo Moon, something rising. Scorpio rising, Capricorn, almost all the other signs except for I think Mercury and Mars, where I'm a Taurus.
Ooh.
There's an app called CoStar.
I'm
on CoStar too. We'll have to see how we sync up. Yeah. So now that we've covered our like star lineage in the truest sense, why don't we have you open with performing/reading for us? And you said you have a largely unedited still piece that you're going to share today.
So I was recently in India visiting family for 3 weeks, and I wrote a poem that could be a little series of poems, new shit, about like reflecting on this trip and family. So here we go.
All right.
In this living room, I swing through history reupholstered by stories, churned by the fan's slow pirouette on the ceiling. I sleep in the same room my great-grandparents dreamt in. Pockets of the present rise like sunspots on the fabric of this lineage. Outside, the crows shriek their gossip. Sweat dews on the door guard's mustache, stuffy by his uniform, olive green and decorless. The combination Zarathustra/Jesus shrine, landmarked at the end of the driveway, surrenders to the sun's growing brutality. Layers of photos peeling whiter and whiter flags as the years went by. In the shelter of someone's porch, a man with a giant bundle of roses blows its thorns kisses before skipping in between cars to sell romance to traffic. The elders are full of names. English makes me forget. They perform stories with the confidence of having rehearsed them in front of people and not mirrors. Tomorrow is the birth of Shiva. By this time, you will be on a plane back home. I will stay awake the whole night, accidentally celebrating. The election is an ambient reckoning we all know the result of already. The election plays shadow puppets on the border, a pressured horizon where the sun sets lopsided and cruelly awake. The election is an air beckoning his silent maid to push him on the swing in the park downtown. The election is a dull guillotine against her sunken neck, the queen's necklace hung noose around the biggest slum in the world. But we intellectuals, we bob our heads, content in the security of already knowing which shuffled cup has had the money hidden underneath it all along. It's the champagne glass, and it keeps getting filled whenever I turn my head. Set yourself apart from the ordinary. A billboard tempts above someone's house, slated to be paved over as soon as a permit reaches the desk of someone's very important father. In the billboard, the woman gazes out of her full mirror-length window into the ocean, orange with sunset. Those who are sensitive should avoid long periods outdoors. Today's air quality assessment was a 4, a good crosswalk green. The billboard woman is indoors, perpetually opening her curtains in glee, gazing into what frontiers glitter as the light turns red. Thank you.
That was so good. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. A couple quick things I want to ask you about it.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'm going to go ahead and rattle off all the questions so you can pick what you want.
Oh, yeah.
So first, I love that you went for long form because I feel like this actually ties to our conversation. In like the social media era, long form is sort of like erased a little bit sometimes because it's not as tweetable or like Instagram friendly. So one thing I'd like to hear about is what it was like writing the long form poem, why you felt that this piece required that form, and then narrative and time. So I'm like, okay, there's a clear like story that you're situating us in, and the kind of, I love the present pockets line.
Thank you.
I don't have it memorized yet, obviously, but I was like, ooh, that's rich, you know? Or like there's these hyper present moments, like the dew on his mustache, right? But then you're also going back and forth between like linear kinship relations and also this kind of diasporic experience with time. So that's a lot of commentary. The questions hidden inside are form and time, like long form and time.
Yeah, I feel what you said about long form kind of being lost with social media. I think one thing that made me kind of write in this long sort of meandering pace is that there's a lot of like small moments I think captured within it, which is how like I felt being in this country that like I'm told is my homeland, but I've never been there, and that really what I'm just processing and holding on to are like these tiny moments because I can't comprehend the vast scale of everything, and at the same time those moments I'm trying to like find a story within them, and I'm trying to find some kind of lineage or some kind of way to make sense of them. And I started the poem in the house I was staying at in Mumbai. I wrote this poem in Mumbai, and I was staying in a place with so much history because it is like the place where my great-grandparents lived and my grandparents grew up in, and there's such rich history there that I know like I'll never really understand, but just know snippets of, with like pictures around the house or just bits of stories that my grandparents and my elders rehearse, you know, in performing and telling. So this poem, I think, to me, like one thing that felt kind of like, oh, I need to edit this, is like it's too all over the place, and then at the same time that's what my experience felt like. It was like, oh, everything is like all over the place and I'm still trying to piece a narrative together, which is what diaspora feels like to me. Like, I don't know if it resonates with people of diaspora going back to a place of their family's origin.
What I love is you're identifying that it sort of has this meandering pace. I think all over the place has negative connotations, right? And I know for myself, it didn't feel like all over the place with the negative connotations. It really felt much more like it was meandering and kind of going through these different scenes. And it was like, we're entering this scene and now we're leaving, and now we're entering this scene and now we're leaving. So it's sort of a restlessness, perhaps. But like you're saying, it's like very true to the experience. Like, it's not like all over the place because the person is just whatever, like blurting stuff out, if that makes sense. I took it as very much part of that searching, if that makes sense. Like, where does the narrator rest? So I actually, to positive talk you, I don't think all over the place in the negative sense. I think it was very purposefully meandering is how I was hearing it. And the language was still sonically very tight, right? I think you called the election ambient or something like that. Yeah, and I was like, oh, like that is like a really good way of putting that, though. So there are some like sonically dense lines in there that anchor it. And I think that it's a great example of when long form serves the content quite well. Because if you were to shorten it, we would lose that sense that diaspora offers. I recommend it to you, and I recommend all the time on here, but I'm doing it again, Banu Kapil's poems, because both her books, Schizophrene and Vertical Interrogation Stranger, is basically one long poem that is the same sort of like entering a scene, leaving a scene, entering a scene, leaving a scene. So I loved it.
Thank you.
Why... Well, you already explained pretty much why you picked it for today, but why, in terms of what other things you want to talk about, did you pick this poem today?
Yeah, I picked this poem kind of going off what you said about like lines anchoring this kind of restlessness. Is one thing I experienced kind of being a tourist is that I knew it would have been kind of easy for me to write about the glossy, very like kind of manufactured film over the reality, like the cruel reality of India and like all the issues that it's facing. And I could have written about those moments, but like what anchored me was the underlying violence. So while I was on this trip, I was reading a lot of books by Arundhati Roy, who's an Indian author, a novelist, and an essayist. And in her novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, she describes this scene where there's a lot of protests happening in Delhi, and these are protests that have been ongoing for years. She describes this group of mothers from Kashmir who are demanding answers to why their sons have been disappeared and called militants. There's a group of people from like survivors of the Bhopal gas leak, just showing these very terrifying images of people being scarred, and like so much violence has been inflicted on all of these protesters, but reporters are not, they're just like glossing over them. And she writes a line that's like, these tragedies are so last year, or they have kind of expired. And I think about that a lot with social media, with how certain traumas become trending, and how for a lot of people fighting in these movements that demand justice, a lot of the time like we feel pressured to take the most like visceral and the most like horrifying pictures of violence and then put them at the forefront just to hold people's attention. And I'm worried about how that can feel like clickbaity almost, you know, and become kind of dehumanizing. And I think about like what happens when people stop paying attention to the most violent current thing, because I feel like it can become desensitizing. I think we're living in a time now where we have like unprecedented access to so much information, and we've become like desensitized to a lot of violence, like not just to people being killed, but also like kind of what you said before with subtle violences. And I think like that can kind of keep us looking for like the most extreme thing to protest about or to tweet about or to share. And that's what I felt a lot of the time reading about Indian politics, is that there's just so much tragedy that's embedded in a country, and like same with America and like any country, and it's just, it becomes like part of the fabric, and then you just kind of wait for a really extreme thing to pop up every once in a while to pay attention to, and then the cycle just kind of repeats. And I'm worried about like what that does to our ability to empathize and our mental health. Because social media can be like a great tool to raise awareness, but like what's the limit to raising awareness?
You know?
Right. With social media especially, I've actually like up-talked social media a lot on this show, because I think scholars and poets are sometimes very like prematurely suspicious of it because they don't get it, right? So they're like, all the things wrong with it, but they've never actually done it. And I'm suspicious of people that critique without having and otherwise build on to that, because I'm like, oh, like what's keeping you from creating what you think does work then, right? But on the other hand, if in terms of critiquing social media, this ties to what bothers me the most about it, I think, is it requires also reducing content, right? So like what I struggle with Twitter, for instance, is like you can only be so complex. And I know that people will say like more words doesn't equal complexity, and I agree with that. But on the flip side, fewer words does not necessarily guarantee complexity. So it's like, what types of violence are things that people can condense into like 32 characters, right? Or into one picture, and Instagram has a limit on the caption as well, right? Like I recently on Instagram, I don't usually post about this kind of stuff, but I posted about a harassment experience I had. And the limitation on the word limit, like the limitation on the word limit, I'm tired. The word limitation did reduce how much complexity I could address. You know, like it just, in a fact, like I couldn't say like this and not explain it, or this and not explain it. So I had to keep the narrative of it very singular. So I'm wondering too about with like this sort of burst of short form poetry, like Twitter poets, Instagram poets, and then this kind of globalized proliferation of trauma narratives, like how we navigate that, like how do we center voices that need to be centered, right? And how do we pay attention to and reckon with these violences without reducing them or flattening them to fit like the packageable modes that we have.
I wrote a poem about Charlena Lyles about 1.5 years ago now, and Charlena Lyles was a black mother who was murdered by Seattle police in June 2017, and I was just incredibly heartbroken and enraged and terrified, and at the same time I knew that when I was writing, like when I was trying to write a poem to like process these feelings, that I'm writing it as someone who is just witnessing and just knows the story through social media and the articles that have been written about this woman that I don't know personally. And I think like one thing that poets and like artists, like we have to grapple with in this era, especially like with social media, is like what stories are we entitled to tell, and from what position do we tell them from? So I wrote this poem about Charlena Lyles firmly from the perspective of sharing like identities with her, but also knowing that I am still alive and that I have the privilege to be able to write this poem and perform this poem like to other people who like are not her family. And I actually did share the poem with her family at one point. And yeah, I think like we have to be careful of the intention that we have with sharing stories of violence that are not ours, especially within slam, which is like a whole nother like can of worms.
Yeah.
I performed the poem about Charlena at a slam, at a Youth Speaks Seattle Slam, which adds like a whole nother layer of like, oh, I'm using this woman's story to get tens. That doesn't really like sit well with me.
Yeah.
And I'm using it like to win, even though that's not my intention. So
because was it because you were putting it out in a competitive space? So like you were reading and performing it in a space where you would be ranked like higher or lower based on the piece. Is that why it felt like a using it versus a sharing?
Yeah, it felt like using it. Even like sometimes when I like try to put things on my Instagram, I'm not good at like putting things on my Instagram, but I know I'm like trying to build a brand of myself, of someone who's into social justice, and that involves almost like capturing so many different traumas and like putting them on this stage over and over and over again. But I will say, like, I think the other side of that kind of being like kind of fighting for attention and the like overstimulation of social media is, I think there is a certain kind of genius and intelligence that like younger people have to be able to pay attention to so many different things. And I found another poem that I wrote about like artificial intelligence, and I think that also like ties into social media, because I think we're in an economy of attention. And to a lot of people, like if you don't cultivate an online presence, you don't have a personality. And I think with like activist poets or slam poets who are just like code for people of color who are poets and like feel called to write poems about our identities, which is like so often reflecting on violence that's inflicted on our communities, is that we have to like continually prove that we're like responding to the times and that we're woke and that this, and like that involves catching people's attention through writing about violence, because that's a way of like holding people's attention.
One of the reasons I try to make the project always come back to coalition building, like truly it is the simplest mission statement ever. You know, it's like there is hope in these types of critiques, and I do firmly believe that it comes through creating coalitional dialogues. And the upside of being able to talk about these different things on social media is you're able to create these coalitions you wouldn't otherwise have. You know, like I think about like hashtag Black Lives Matter, people who never would have connected, right? And hopefully productive ones. Like there's overlap then between Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Ban the Wall. Like you find these intersections where coalitions wouldn't have been built. So I think that like you're really pinning down again that like dialectic space really of like on the one hand there's this kind of like grossness to feeling like you have to brand yourself. There is no universe in which marginalized folks should have to air their traumas to be heard. So that can be, I think, worked through in terms of how we value poetry and how we read as readers. Like when are we expecting marginalized writers to perform their pain for us? You know, and that's like, I think, a self-responsibility more so than the artists to have to navigate. And then vice versa, I think that it creates opportunities for these really cool coalitions to happen that like otherwise wouldn't happen. You know what I mean? So it's not just like you're putting it out there to build a brand, like you're putting it out there to participate in the space the dialogue's happening. You know?
Yeah, to reach people you couldn't otherwise reach.
Right. All right, are you ready?
Yes.
All right, so you're going to read us a poem by Luther Hughes. now I'm going to contextualize this, right? Luther Hughes is a local poet here in Seattle, as well as activist, and you might recognize his name from A Poet Salon. It's a podcast run by him, Gabrielle Bates. You can check out her episode from way back in the first season. And Duji Tahat is their co-host as well. Okay, so thank you, Azura, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really
such a
excited.
good discussion.
I'm really glad that you feel that way. I was really lucky to have you here and I enjoyed it as well. Everyone, if you're like, Azura's so cool, first of all, comment below saying Azura's so cool, because when you're a young poet and you go on YouTube and we talk about social media, it's very vulnerable. So I'm, especially for these episodes, asking folks if in the comments they'll be like, thanks, you know, like show appreciation for that vulnerability. And then also go say hi to her on social. She named them earlier in the episode, so if you're podcast listeners, now you need to use the links, right? But if you're watching on the episode here, you see it scrolling on the bottom. And then stay tuned for more from the Youth Poet Laureate program, because we're going to do a webinar and symposium in April when you're all together. I don't know if Dr. Pena told you that. Yeah, so they'll all be gathered and you'll see them all again, and the National Youth Poet Laureate will be named, which is pretty cool and really exciting. So that's about it. As always, comment, like, subscribe. When I get enough subscribers, I get a personalized URL, which is kind of exciting, right? And always leave me feedback at thepoetryvlog.com. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you again, Azura, and stay tuned for the rest of the National Youth Poet Laureate program. Bye.